The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden light across the city. In a modest neighborhood far from the sparkling towers and glass facades, a woman was already at work. She moved with purpose and grace, even though her hands were worn and her body tired from years of labor. Her name was not known to many outside her small circle, but to those who knew her, she was a symbol of resilience and quiet strength. She lived in a small apartment with faded walls and creaky floors. It was not much, but it was hers. She had learned early on that life was not always fair, and that dignity was not measured by wealth or possessions. Every day she woke before dawn, prepared her simple breakfast, and got ready for the work that paid her bills and kept her family safe. She had a routine, and she knew it well. But no routine could prepare her for the day she would walk into a house full of wealth and cruelty. The mansion she entered each morning was unlike anything she had ever seen in her life. Towering ceilings, marble floors, and walls lined with priceless art created an environment that was both breathtaking and intimidating. She had worked here for a few months, cleaning, cooking, and attending to tasks that others would consider beneath them. She had learned to move silently, to anticipate needs, and to carry herself with calm efficiency. Yet no amount of skill or caution could shield her from the cruelty that would soon come. He was a man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room. Tall, sharply dressed, with an air of arrogance that seemed to seep from every pore, he was the billionaire owner of the house. His reputation preceded him. Known for his ruthless business deals and disdain for anyone who did not share his wealth, he had built an empire worth billions. To him, people like her were invisible, useful only when needed, disposable the moment they made a mistake. That morning she moved through the rooms, dusting, polishing, and arranging. Every surface gleamed under her careful hands. She was meticulous as always, and she took pride in her work. Pride, however, was a dangerous thing in this house because it often went unnoticed or was met with scorn. He appeared without warning in the hallway, his presence filling the space with tension. She looked up politely, expecting a simple greeting or a nod. Instead, she received a sharp, disdainful glance. "This is unacceptable," he barked. "I can't believe someone could be so careless. Look at this mess. Are you even trying?" Her heart sank, but she kept her composure. She knew that reacting emotionally would only make things worse. She explained calmly that she had cleaned every corner the night before, but her words were drowned out by his anger. "You're just trash," he snapped, his voice loud enough to carry into the rooms where guests had begun to gather. "Do you understand what I am saying? Trash. I don't have time for people who make my house look like a dump." The words hit her like a punch. She had heard insults before, but never with such venom. Never from someone who had the power to humiliate her in front of strangers. The guests stared, some with polite discomfort, others with amusement, but none with empathy. The contrast between her small, dignified figure and his towering arrogance was painfully clear. She swallowed the lump in her throat and continued her work, pretending not to hear, pretending the words had no power over her. But inside, a storm of emotions raged. Anger, humiliation, and a deep sense of injustice coursed through her. She had spent her life working hard, treating everyone with respect, and yet here she was, being dismissed as worthless by a man who measured people only by their usefulness to him. As the morning wore on, she moved through the house with quiet determination. Every task she completed was an act of defiance, a reminder that her value was not determined by his words. She cleaned, polished, and organized, letting the rhythm of her work soothe her spirit. She reminded herself that she had skills, intelligence, and a heart that could not be broken by mere words. Her mind, however, was already turning. She began to think about the power imbalance, the unfairness that allowed someone like him to belittle and control others. She thought about the ways she could learn, grow, and eventually create a life where she would never be at the mercy of such cruelty. The seed of determination was planted that day, a quiet promise to herself that she would rise above the humiliation. Lunch came and went, but she did not eat much. Her thoughts were consumed with strategy, with how she could turn her situation into an opportunity rather than a trap. She noticed the patterns in the house, the routines of the staff, the weaknesses in the way the mansion was run. Knowledge was her weapon, and she began to collect it carefully like a spider weaving a web. The guests left eventually, and the house returned to its usual silence. The billionaire retired to his office, unaware that his words had ignited a fire within her. She continued her work with renewed focus, each movement deliberate, each task completed with excellence. She refused to allow his cruelty to define her worth. As the day ended, she returned to her small apartment. The contrast between the opulence of the mansion and her modest home was stark, but she felt no envy. She felt resolve. She made herself a simple meal, sat by the window, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. The humiliation had been sharp, but it had also revealed something important: her strength. That night she lay in bed, thinking not of revenge, but of growth. She would not allow herself to be broken by a man who saw her only as disposable. She would learn, prepare, and eventually she decided she would turn the tables. She had no plan yet, only a burning desire to change the course of her life and prove that her value was far greater than anyone's insult could ever measure. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and restorative. In her dreams, she imagined a life of respect, achievement, and dignity. The day had been cruel, but it had also been illuminating. She had seen the sharp edge of arrogance, and in response, she had found the quiet steel of determination. The morning would come again, and she would return to the mansion, but this time something inside her had shifted. The humiliation had been a spark, and now a fire of purpose burned within her. She was ready to endure, to observe, and to prepare. She would not be trash. She would be far more than he could ever imagine, and one day she would ensure that he knew it too. The morning light filtered gently through the curtains of her small apartment. The events of the previous day still lingered in her mind, but instead of feeling defeated, she felt a strange kind of clarity. The humiliation at the mansion had awakened something in her, a determination that had been quietly growing for years. She had always been strong, but now she realized that strength alone was not enough. She needed knowledge, strategy, and the courage to step beyond the boundaries life had set for her. After preparing her simple breakfast, she settled down at the small table by the window. She had been collecting books, articles, and online resources for months. Most evenings, after the work at the mansion, she would read about finance, business operations, and legal matters. She had taught herself the basics, but now, fueled by recent events, she was ready to study harder and deeper. Her first task was to understand the billionaire's empire. She knew only the surface details, the companies, the properties, and the wealth, but she needed to see the skeleton behind the facade. Late into the night, she pored over public records, business filings, and news articles. She read interviews, watched press conferences, and listened carefully to any gossip or insider knowledge she could gather from casual conversations at the mansion. Every detail mattered. She discovered patterns. The billionaire had built his empire through aggressive deals, often taking advantage of weaker partners and cutting corners in ways that were legal, but morally questionable. There were rumors of mismanagement in certain divisions, poor treatment of employees, and neglected obligations to investors. Small mistakes overlooked and ignored had begun to pile up, creating cracks in the armor of his supposedly untouchable wealth. She kept all of this in her mind, storing it like a secret treasure. Knowledge, she realized, was her first weapon. While he relied on intimidation and money, she could rely on strategy and intelligence. Unlike him, she could not be blinded by arrogance or pride. She began to map out these weaknesses, noting which areas were most vulnerable and where she might have leverage. Even from her position as a maid at the mansion, she continued her work with care and attention, her mind quietly shifting between the physical tasks in front of her and the larger plan forming in the background. She learned to listen, not just to commands, but to conversations, tones, and offhand remarks. Sometimes a careless word from the billionaire revealed more about his empire than any public report. She noticed his impatience with certain managers, the mistakes he dismissed too lightly, and the moments when his pride made him blind to the truth. Meanwhile, she also began to notice the people around him. The staff, the business associates, the friends who flattered him without question. Many of them had stories similar to hers, small humiliations and injustices that went unnoticed because the world valued wealth over human dignity. She began forming mental connections, thinking of how alliances could be built quietly, how these individuals could one day be part of a larger plan to reveal the truth. Her evenings were no longer for rest alone. She attended free community workshops online, joined discussion forums about business ethics, and even reached out discreetly to professionals who could answer her questions. Her curiosity and diligence impressed some of the people she met, though they did not yet know her full story. She learned about accounting irregularities, legal loopholes, and ways in which large corporations could be held accountable. Every lesson was a piece of armor, every detail a potential tool. Days turned into weeks, and her life took on a new rhythm. At work, she remained polite, efficient, and invisible when necessary. She kept her emotions hidden, masking the fire that had been lit within her. But in the quiet corners of the mansion, she began to test small ideas. She noted how decisions were made, which departments were vulnerable, and which executives were careless with sensitive information. Each observation was stored in her memory, ready to be used at the right moment. One evening, after the mansion had grown silent and the billionaire had retired to his office, she stayed behind under the pretense of finishing chores. She quietly accessed the online portals that staff were allowed to use and began tracking patterns. Transactions, property documents, employee reports. She had no formal access to sensitive data, but she was clever, patient, and careful. She learned to observe without drawing attention, to read between the lines, and to notice what others ignored. Outside the mansion, she started networking subtly. She had learned that change could not happen in isolation. She reached out to trusted friends, mentors, and professionals, seeking advice and learning new skills. Each conversation was like a thread, weaving a larger tapestry that could one day become her path forward. She did not speak of revenge or humiliation. She spoke of growth, strategy, and knowledge. Every step she took was measured, calculated, and deliberate. Her personal life also became a source of energy. She helped neighbors with errands, tutored local children in basic finance and reading, and volunteered at community centers. These acts reminded her of the value of dignity, compassion, and strength. While the billionaire sought to humiliate and control, she sought to uplift and empower. This contrast became her quiet motivation, one of the purest forms of power. Despite the growing pressure and the challenges of balancing work, study, and personal life, she remained steady. She learned to manage time like a professional, prioritizing tasks, setting small goals, and celebrating incremental progress. She knew that patience was key. Her ultimate aim was not just to prove a point to the billionaire, but to secure a future where her worth was recognized, where knowledge and courage could overcome arrogance and cruelty. One evening, as she reviewed the notes she had been keeping for weeks, a thought struck her. The humiliation she had endured was not the end. It was the beginning. The spark that had been ignited in that hallway where he called her trash had grown into a fire. She realized that she was no longer just reacting. She was planning, observing, and preparing. Every lesson learned, every observation made, and every connection established was a step toward reclaiming control. She allowed herself a small smile, quiet and private. The journey ahead would be long, filled with challenges and obstacles, but for the first time she felt empowered. She had turned her anger and humiliation into a tool for growth. The billionaire had underestimated her, as he had underestimated so many others, and that mistake would one day become evident. Before sleeping, she reflected on the contrast between her small apartment and the mansion. It no longer felt like a disadvantage. Her life was her own, and her mind was free. She had begun to see opportunities in places others saw only limitations. The mansion, the billionaire, the insults, they were all pieces of a puzzle she was quietly learning to solve. She was no longer just a maid. She was a strategist, an observer, and a student of the world she had been thrust into. As she drifted into sleep, her mind was alive with possibilities. The journey was only beginning, but she was ready. Ready to learn, ready to grow, and ready to transform her life from one of quiet endurance to one of calculated triumph. The humiliation of yesterday had given way to the determination of today, and the future was hers to shape, step by step, with intelligence, patience, and courage. Weeks passed, and the maid's life had transformed in ways the billionaire could never have imagined. She had become meticulous in her planning, careful in her observation, and strategic in her actions. At the mansion, she continued her work with quiet efficiency, but her mind was always alert, analyzing every detail, every conversation, and every small misstep that could later become leverage. She had begun to understand the personalities around her. The staff, often overlooked by the billionaire, had stories of injustice and frustration. Some were loyal to him out of fear or habit, while others were quietly resentful of his arrogance and mistreatment. She listened not to gossip, but to gather insight. Each piece of information was a clue, helping her to see the patterns of control and weakness that lay behind the empire's glittering surface. The billionaire's business associates were another source of insight. Many were careless, self-interested, or overly confident in the billionaire's power. She noticed how they handled financial reports, legal documents, and operational challenges. Small errors, overlooked filings, and minor oversights appeared repeatedly. These were not major issues in isolation, but together they formed a picture of vulnerability. In the evenings, she continued her studies. She focused on financial analysis, corporate law, and investigative techniques. She learned how to interpret business reports, identify discrepancies, and spot patterns that others missed. Her ability to absorb information was remarkable, and she applied it immediately, cross-referencing what she learned with the notes she had gathered at the mansion. She also started keeping a detailed record of observations. Her notebook, small but meticulously organized, contained notes on staff routines, financial anomalies, and behavior patterns of key individuals. She marked potential allies, those who might be willing to cooperate if approached carefully. She knew that the road ahead would require collaboration, patience, and discretion. One day, she overheard a conversation between two managers about a mismanaged division. They spoke in hushed tones, confident that no one would listen. She noted the details carefully, the errors, the missed deadlines, and the cover-ups. This information would later be critical. It was a reminder that even the most powerful individuals were not infallible, and that attention to detail could reveal their weaknesses. At the mansion, she also noticed small opportunities to test her understanding of the billionaire's behavior. He had predictable routines and habits. He dismissed people quickly when they challenged him, and often revealed his priorities without realizing it. She learned to anticipate his movements and use them to gather information quietly. Each observation built her confidence and prepared her for more significant actions in the future. She began reaching out to professionals outside the mansion, carefully building a network of mentors and experts who could advise her if needed. She never revealed her identity or her intentions fully, but she asked questions, learned best practices, and understood the legal and financial systems that governed large corporations. Her intellect, patience, and discretion impressed those she contacted, even though they did not know the source of her inquiry. The maid also learned the importance of timing. She understood that rushing into action could lead to mistakes. She observed the flow of the mansion, the patterns of work, and the moments when key individuals were vulnerable. Her patience became one of her most valuable assets. Unlike the billionaire whose arrogance led him to make impulsive decisions, she waited, calculated, and prepared. She also noticed the subtle influence of media and public perception. The billionaire was deeply concerned with reputation, often more than substance. She realized that small, well-placed exposures of mismanagement or ethical breaches could have a significant impact. She began to sketch out a plan, considering how information, alliances, and timing could converge to challenge his empire without putting herself at immediate risk. Her life outside the mansion remained a source of grounding. She continued to help neighbors, volunteer, and participate in her community. These experiences reminded her of her values and the importance of integrity, humility, and compassion. They also gave her a sense of purpose beyond revenge. Her goal was not to humiliate the billionaire for personal satisfaction, but to ensure justice and accountability. One evening, after everyone had left the mansion, she stayed behind under the guise of finishing chores. She quietly accessed publicly available financial records, company filings, and reports from regulatory bodies. She compared them with the notes she had taken over the weeks. Patterns emerged: mismanagement, overvalued assets, and questionable practices that, if exposed, could significantly damage the billionaire's reputation and holdings. She marked each one carefully, creating a map of vulnerabilities. Her strategy began to take shape. She would need allies, evidence, and precision. She thought about the managers she had identified as careless, the staff who had grievances, and the professionals she had been consulting. Each could play a role in her plan. She also recognized the importance of remaining undetected. The billionaire must not suspect her intentions until the moment was right. She rehearsed scenarios in her mind, imagining how each move could unfold. She considered potential obstacles, risks, and unexpected challenges. Her planning was meticulous, her imagination precise. She visualized herself executing each step, confident and composed. This mental preparation was as important as the actual work, as it strengthened her resolve and sharpened her judgment. The maid knew that her plan would not succeed overnight. It required patience, discretion, and unwavering focus. She also understood that her personal growth was part of the journey. Each skill she learned, each observation she made, and each connection she established added to her power. She was no longer a passive observer. She was an architect of change, quietly building the foundation for a future where she would not be dismissed or humiliated. She allowed herself moments of reflection, considering how far she had come. The humiliation she had faced weeks ago had been painful, but it had been a catalyst. It had forced her to see her own potential, to recognize her intelligence and resilience, and to understand that power was not solely measured in money or status. Knowledge, patience, and courage were equally formidable. As night fell, she returned to her apartment, tired but invigorated. She reviewed her notes one last time, cross-checking details and refining her strategy. Her plan was still in its early stages, but the structure was clear. She would act with precision, build alliances, and exploit the vulnerabilities she had carefully documented. Every decision, every observation, every calculated risk brought her closer to her goal. In the quiet of her room, she reflected on the contrast between her life and the billionaire's world. Wealth and arrogance had not brought him wisdom or foresight. He was blind to the human intelligence and determination that now existed right under his nose. She smiled quietly, knowing that patience and preparation were her greatest advantages. One day the billionaire would discover that he had underestimated her, and when that day came, it would change everything. Sleep came with a sense of purpose. She dreamed not of revenge, but of strategy and triumph. The weeks of observation, learning, and planning had prepared her for the next phase. She was no longer just surviving in the mansion. She was preparing to challenge the very foundation of its power. Her journey had moved from endurance to action, and the quiet determination that had begun as a spark was now a steady flame, ready to ignite when the time was right. The maid's days of quiet preparation were coming to a turning point. Months of observing, learning, and planning had sharpened her skills and strengthened her resolve. She had gathered evidence, noticed patterns of mismanagement, and quietly built connections with staff and professionals who could aid her when the time came. The fire of determination within her had grown into a steady blaze, ready to ignite in a decisive moment. At the mansion, she continued to perform her duties with her usual efficiency, keeping her true intentions hidden. She maintained the appearance of a humble maid, polite and unassuming while simultaneously collecting critical information. She noted how the billionaire responded to crises, how he treated his associates, and which areas of his empire were weak. Each day provided new insights, and she added them to her carefully organized notes. Outside the mansion, she strengthened her network. She met with trusted contacts, shared ideas carefully, and learned about methods to expose financial mismanagement and corporate misconduct. She did not act impulsively. Instead, she patiently gathered all the elements she would need for a larger strategy. She understood that precision was key. One misstep could ruin everything she had worked for. The maid had also begun to understand the power of perception. The billionaire's public image was important to him. He relied on a carefully curated persona of success, control, and dominance. She realized that exposing his flaws in the right way could have a profound impact, not just on his reputation, but on the operation of his empire itself. She planned to use this insight to her advantage. One afternoon, she discovered a critical piece of information while organizing documents in the mansion's office. A series of financial transactions had been misrecorded, creating opportunities for exploitation by insiders and leaving the company vulnerable to legal scrutiny. She took note of this, carefully documenting everything without leaving a trace. This discovery reinforced her understanding that the billionaire's empire, though seemingly untouchable, had cracks that could be leveraged. Meanwhile, the staff around her began to trust her judgment and discretion. They saw her as competent, intelligent, and reliable. Gradually, they shared more information with her, unaware that she was carefully building a picture of the vulnerabilities in the billionaire's operations. She listened without judgment, storing details that would later be invaluable. The maid also honed her communication skills. She learned how to present facts, how to ask questions without revealing intent, and how to build credibility. These skills allowed her to navigate the complex social dynamics of the mansion and its staff. She knew that influence, even quiet influence, would be necessary when the time came to challenge the billionaire. Her personal life continued to be a source of inspiration and grounding. She remained engaged in her community, helping neighbors, tutoring children, and volunteering at local centers. These interactions reminded her of the importance of integrity, empathy, and resilience. She drew strength from the knowledge that her efforts were not only about her own success, but about demonstrating that justice and intelligence could triumph over arrogance and cruelty. One evening, she stayed late in the mansion under the guise of finishing chores. She accessed publicly available financial records and compared them with the notes she had meticulously kept. Discrepancies jumped out at her, errors, oversights, and weaknesses that had gone unnoticed by the billionaire. She began to outline a strategy for how this information could be used effectively to challenge him. But she also knew that timing would be critical. Over the next few weeks, she began to implement small, calculated moves. She subtly encouraged staff members to document errors and report mismanagement through official channels, always ensuring that her own role remained invisible. She began to plant seeds of awareness among those who could later act as allies. Each step was careful, deliberate, and aimed at creating a ripple effect that would eventually grow into a wave of accountability. As her plan took shape, she also focused on building evidence in a way that would be undeniable. She documented financial missteps, gathered witness accounts, and compiled information about unethical practices. Her notes were precise, thorough, and organized in a manner that would make them persuasive to authorities, journalists, and business professionals. She understood that a strong foundation of evidence was essential for success. The billionaire, meanwhile, remained unaware of the quiet storm brewing around him. He continued to act with arrogance, dismissing minor errors and overestimating his control. He saw the maid as inconsequential, a background figure in his life. This underestimation became one of her greatest advantages. His blind spots, combined with her meticulous preparation, created an opportunity that she was ready to seize. One morning, she observed the billionaire angrily confront a manager over a miscommunication. The manager was defensive and frustrated, revealing information that had previously been hidden. The maid took mental notes, understanding that these human reactions were as valuable as the financial documents she had gathered. She saw how fear, arrogance, and impatience could create vulnerabilities, and she incorporated these observations into her growing strategy. With each passing day, her confidence increased. She had moved from reaction to action, from observation to strategic planning. She understood that the moment to act would require courage, precision, and timing. She did not rush. She waited, letting each piece of information fall into place, allowing the structure of her plan to solidify. The maid also continued to educate herself about legal avenues, media influence, and corporate accountability. She consulted with experts discreetly, learning how best to present evidence and create impact. She realized that her strategy needed to be comprehensive, combining legal, financial, and public awareness approaches to ensure success. One evening, she reviewed her notes and strategy. She had documented weaknesses, gathered allies, and developed a detailed plan for exposing the billionaire's mismanagement and unethical practices. She knew that executing the plan would be risky, but she also understood that patience, preparation, and careful coordination had minimized those risks. Her mind was calm, focused, and resolute. As she lay down that night, she reflected on how far she had come. From the humiliation of being called trash, she had grown into a strategist, a planner, and an observer with purpose. Her intelligence, patience, and courage had become her tools. She had turned adversity into strength, and she was ready to move from preparation to action. Sleep came with a sense of anticipation. She dreamed not of revenge, but of justice, precision, and triumph. The journey had moved from quiet endurance to careful strategy. The fire that had been ignited in the hallway months ago had grown into a controlled blaze, ready to challenge arrogance, power, and cruelty. The mansion, the billionaire, and his empire were about to encounter the consequences of underestimating the strength and intelligence of someone they had dismissed as insignificant.